Hello, and welcome to the Resource Library presentations produced by the NCC's Comprehensive Digitization and Discoverability Program. In this video series, generously funded by the Toshiba International Foundation, the NCC's CDDP task force highlights projects that are making digital images accessible in new ways. Each presentation discusses the project's content and purpose, how to use the site, and which tools were used to build it. We hope that these videos inspire and support those using images in their work or who plan to digitize their own collections.
Hi, my name's Dylan. I just finished a master's in East Asian Studies at Yale. My research generally focused on disaster, memorialization, and the Buddhist institutional role among those themes. Today I'm going to introduce my digital humanities project about the regional incendiary bombing of Japan, and a couple digital mapping and presentation tools, as well as some of the sources that I used. I'm far from an expert in using these tools, and my goal was not entirely to present maps, but also to create a digital humanities multimedia experience. And finally, I'm also going to describe the entire project from start to finish, because it's illustrative of the course a digital humanities project can take, with shifting goals, technological and time limitations, and the need to change directions fairly quickly. So how did this all begin? Thanks to the guidance of Professor Danny Botsman, this project springboarded off my interest in research of the 1891 Nobi earthquake and the 1923 Great Kanto disaster. As I read more about the memorial to the Kanto disaster of 1923, which also includes a memorial to the incendiary bombing of Tokyo, I began to read more about the incendiary bombing itself, and it became apparent that there were undeniable parallels between the two. So, with this and other preliminary research, I believed that there was room to make a small contribution to the history of regional firebombing in English, trying to focus on more granular experiences and doing so in a digital format. This research, as well as the work of other scholars, particularly David Fedman and Carrie Caracas, led me to a variety of highly visual and text sources. These included United States military documents about targets in Japan and post-raid reports, which incorporated a plethora of maps and information about why a target was a target, post-war air raid damage maps compiled by the Japanese government, maps and photographs from the Kokudo Chiriin, the Geospatial Information Authority of Japan, some of which are hosted by Stanford, the ever-present local histories at prefecture and city level, from which I pulled data tables, histories of schools that were firebombed, ration orders from prefectural authorities, and general narratives of the bombing, a couple different collections of personal recollections of the bombing, current Japanese Internal Ministry compilations of memorials, and a couple interesting documents that appeared from simple Google searches. Before I discuss the project more, I want to take a moment to describe some of the ways that scholars have used or relied on maps in their scholarship on Japanese history, a list which is unquestionably incomplete. In Japan in Print, Beth Berry argues that the numerical expansion of maps during the Middle Tokugawa period, compared to previous eras, indicated or was a precondition for a mental, ideological change towards something resembling the space of a nation. Berry works into her analysis local-level maps, regional maps, an imaginary college map, and unpacks the ideas embedded in maps. In The Making of a Japanese Periphery, 1750 to 1920, Karen Wiegand incorporates a prolific number of maps, and figures, and tables to describe the economic and industrial state, and then transformation, of the Shimuina region from its, quote, proto-industrial state up to its highly industrialized state in the 1920s as a, quote, cul-de-sac and a, quote, precarious industrial supply zone. Throughout, the maps and figures are some of the most delightful and illustrative of their kind, sometimes saying more than Wiegand can in prose. Cartographic Japan, edited by Karen Wiegand, Sugimoto Fumiko, and Carrie Caracas, incorporates dozens of brief studies with unique maps as their central investigative object and document, creating an extensive collection of hyper-focused essays about different moments in Japanese history. Fabian Drixler, along with 4 other experts in their respective fields of study and technology, have been working on the Digital Tokugawa Lab, with their primary goal to create a digital atlas of Tokugawa Japan, spanning, quote, feudal territories across 270 years, and down to each of the 60,000 villages of the era. The boundary maps will be made available for public use. Finally, the work of David Fedman and Carrie Caracas to examine the firebombing of Tokyo has deeply incorporated maps from the United States Air Force, in particular charting how the USAF reconceptualized Japan's cities not as variegated spaces with schools, infrastructure, and other buildings, but as only targets. Their work and the website they maintain, japanairraids.org, has proven influential for my project. Back to the project. As seems to be the case with digital projects, my ambition was high at the beginning. I wanted to build a whole website from the ground up, comparing multiple city experiences, using a map of Japan with incendiary locations as the homepage. Despite realizing that I was at least a little bit in over my head, what with the need to comprehensively learn HTML, CSS, and probably another programming language like JavaScript, I did land on a couple different resources that would help bring my ideas to life. They were ArcMap, ArcGIS Online, and StoryMaps, all maintained by ArcGIS. And I was fortunate enough to have access to these services thanks to my university. ArcMap is easily the more complicated of these tools. Unfortunately, my access to ArcMap has lapsed, so I can't show you exactly how I tinkered with ArcMap. Nonetheless, ArcMap is a professional tool for GIS specialists, but I was able to navigate it even with limited goals. 1. To overlay post-war incendiary damage maps with Meiji-era survey maps, and 2. Plot the locations of US incendiary bombing attacks. I figured that placing post-war damage maps on top of maps from before and after could produce some interesting comparisons and insights, like what schools survived and existed today? Was a large portion of the bombing area initially urban or suburban? And what does it look like today? Could the survey maps help us understand some of the infrastructure at stake in these bombing campaigns? In principle, the process is easy. You take 2 maps and identify corresponding points on each, which eventually allows one to be re-stretched on top of the other. Sometimes, to make sure the maps appropriately overlay, you have to make dozens of reference points. In my case, what often ended up happening was the map would be stretched incoherently or shuttled off to another part of the globe. I had some success, but since it took me hours and hours of tinkering and identifying the best points for referencing, I ultimately scrapped the incorporation into my project. While I tinkered with ArcMap, I switched my focus from creating a standalone website to utilizing ArcGIS Online and ArcGIS StoryMaps, an online customizable website platform where I could present my research. Part of that process meant using ArcGIS Online, essentially a scaled down and simpler version of ArcMap, hosted online rather than a standalone program. I also needed my maps uploaded to ArcGIS Online so they would load into the eventual StoryMaps project. My first goal was to enter all of the points of incendiary bombing in Japan. This went through a couple of iterations because of user data entry error. In other words, I was often tired, and then ArcGIS Online seemed to skew some of the points. For example, Sasebo's location was mapped into the sea, despite me rechecking the input multiple times. To plot these points, I first pulled up incendiary maps from the National Diet Library, identifying a subjective center of the attack. Then I tried to roughly match that with another feature on a present-day Google map, like say a river. Click, make a point, and grab the latitude and longitude, and plug it into an Excel sheet. Then turn the Excel sheet into a CSV file, and upload it to ArcGIS Online. And voila, there's my data. Ultimately, I opted not to use the map that I had created in ArcGIS Online for 2 reasons. First, it would replicate what the original source map from the US government was doing, and second, I didn't feel it was as visually compelling as that original source, although it would have been easier to read in some respects. The previous tinkering and experience with ArcGIS Online and ArcMap, as well as my need for a simpler method to present my findings, led me to StoryMaps. Thanks to a public humanities class with Professor Karen Rothman, by the time I began putting a later version of this project together on StoryMaps, I had gained some experience with the platform through a separate project, and an earlier version of the incendiary bombing presentation. StoryMaps ultimately proved to be a solid tool for presenting my narrative of regional incendiary bombing, but it also had its flaws. As a multimedia storytelling tool, the platform thrived. One of my favorite parts was the header video. The video is a post-war American aerial survey, one of many, of bombed cities. After cutting the video into a shorter length, and thus a smaller file size, I was able to upload it to become the header, presenting the aftermath before I had begun narrating, almost like an epigraph in a book. While I had struggled to overlay the maps in the beginning of the project, StoryMaps allowed me to use a slider type of module to place a Meiji-era survey map alongside a post-war damage map. Thanks to the Stanford Digital Repository, drawing on maps from Japan's Kokudo Chiriin, I could host these on the site without any copyright restrictions, because they exist in the public domain. Presenting most other maps and images from the Kokudo Chiriin directly meant a heap more copyright restrictions and costs that would have been insurmountable. One of my goals for the project was to juxtapose US identified targets with the level of damage and lived experience of the bombings. To that end, using ArcGIS Online to plug in target locations in Toyama, since there were around a dozen, was useful for understanding one of the ways one subdivision of the US Air Force was thinking about bombing the city and region. I followed this map with quotes from the Tactical Mission Report, which was essentially a report of the mission to incendiary bomb the city, from preparations to completion, as well as damage assessment. While perhaps heavy-handed and a bit intentionally emotive, I followed this with a longer passage from a collection of first-hand accounts from the firebombing of Toyama. So here was one of the benefits of StoryMaps, visual evidence working in tandem with textual evidence. One of my initial hopes with the project, back before I had committed to StoryMaps, was to present a non-linear, malleable story. Sven Lindqvist wrote a history of bombing, which I would describe as a choose-your-own-adventure style of reading, where the reader could choose different themes, following that theme throughout the book. Each theme would lead you from short passage to short passage, in the end presenting a holistic story of, say, incendiary bombing. StoryMaps was linear, and stubbornly so. In an initial version, I had attempted to present the project through a kind of map tour or image tour, where images would guide the narration, but it felt far too disconnected and unfocused. And of course, aside from a navigation bar where one could skip ahead, the final version was essentially linear, drawing in much of the textual sourcing, in particular individual experiences written down, that I wanted to include. There were also practical limitations for the platform. Citation could be difficult, especially for those of us used to Chicago manual of style. Superscript was not an option, and adding in something like parenthetical citations would disrupt the storytelling itself. So I opted for introducing sources in text and hyperlinking to direct sources as it made sense, with a list of references and further reading at the end. For things like graphs that I created, this meant a caption with the book name and publication date, with a fuller citation below. Other times, with things like tactical mission reports, I would link directly to the page where it could be accessed, which is definitely one of the upsides to a web platform. But citation did still feel insufficient throughout, since I had to balance the citation with the role of telling the story in a streamlined and neat-looking way. The other practical limitation was that editing the page was often cumbersome and annoying. After adding even a small amount of text and images, the editing page would be slow to scroll and often take time to load as I clicked buttons to add things. This added another level of tedium to the process. After toiling with a couple different tools for this project, I feel confident in saying that StoryMaps presented a solution for some of the ways that I wanted to tell this story. It also simply wasn't built for being a solution to some of the other key aspects that I wanted, especially non-linearity. But this felt like a new way to incorporate some aspects of mapping and multimedia to tell the story of regional incendiary bombing during World War II. And it felt like an appropriate way to do so because of the amount of visual, illustrative multimedia sources out there. In some respects, I think that the project contains an almost parallel narrative, where the images could stand alone to speak differently for themselves. To me, all the platforms function as interesting ways to present academic or near-academic studies. Although I admit that more of my time was spent tinkering with and understanding the presentation methodology than the intellectual rigor of the text. To that end, these platforms function as a way to reimagine already solidified essays and chapters. Please check out the description below for the project itself. I hope what I've presented here proves useful. Thanks for watching.
Thank you for watching the presentation. We hope you found it useful. Please check other videos in the CDDP presentation library.